We're going to talk a bit more about this now with an expert in international relations, Elizabeth Sheppard Sellam. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us. Now, as we just heard there, France and the UK say they are ready to send ground forces to assure lasting peace in Ukraine. But the European countries do vary greatly on the different kinds of guarantees that they're each willing to offer. What kind of guarantees are we talking about from which countries, and who's the most reticent?
So remember that when we're talking about European countries here, we're not just talking about the European Union, obviously, since we are talking about the UK. What we saw, for example, in terms of France, yesterday in Macron's speech, was talking about notably not on the front lines, which I think is what most of the Europeans are talking about, but in the case of France, for example, protecting certain cities and certain critical infrastructures. I think he spoke about electricity, for example, and others. There are a couple of sort of caveats. One, obviously, not everyone is willing to contribute or doesn't want to contribute in the same way. We see this Franco-British axis being very important, but we do see more reticence, let's say, from the Germans and then from those neighbors of the EU that are much further away, that see less of an interest in investing in and in contributing to a coalition. It is notable, of course, to say also that even with France, who is willing to invest in humans and soldiers and in military, that they were very clear to say that it wouldn't be on the front lines, so that at least theoretically, we're not talking about direct confrontation with the Russians, unless, of course, the Russians decide to bomb beyond the border. We're also talking, obviously, about something he said, not peacekeepers in the traditional format, meaning it won't be again on the front line, but it will require some sort of signed peace deal, which is perhaps the most difficult part of this entire deal.
So what are your thoughts? Do you believe it is absolutely necessary to get some kind of boots on the ground in Ukraine to make sure that the ceasefire holds?
I do think that there have to be boots on the ground to make sure that the ceasefire holds, and to clearly show Europe's intentions towards Russia, which I think is the other objective of these troops, to show that if they go any further, including to those countries that are part of the European Union or NATO, that they will find resistance. So I think that it's both dissuasion as well as a necessary part of this ceasefire deal. But of course, that does require a ceasefire deal.
It certainly does. And of course, the U.S. and Europe have very different approaches to Russia. For example, how has Europe reacted to this U.S. brokered agreement with Russia that would, in theory, see a cessation of hostilities in the Black Sea?
I think the European view and the view of many is that the United States is basically caving into the Russians, because that's what it is. And the Russians have said that basically this deal would happen only if sanctions are removed on Russia. And we see very clearly that it's in their interests, but we don't see necessarily a lot of anything in the Ukrainians' interest. So it's a very biased deal. And I think that that's what we're hearing most in Europe compared to the United States.
Now, we are hearing that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, actually spoke to Donald Trump earlier today before that summit began. I mean, what does that say about Europe's need, if you like, to get America's approval before it moves forward?
Well, I think that whether we like it or not, Trump and Putin have excluded up to this point, to a very large extent, Europe from the negotiations, and even to a certain extent, Ukraine. But at the same time, the Americans have asked the Europeans in a number of occasions, or said that the Europeans are going to have to take part in, whether it be President Trump or Marco Rubio. We've heard various versions of that. So it does need to be a discussion, a multi-partite discussion, and I think that that's what we're seeing today as well.
Of course, another big question in all of this is Russia and its thinking. It could be merely using these negotiations as a sort of stalling tactic just to get more concessions from the U.S., for example, while continuing its military campaign. I mean, I guess the question is Moscow genuinely interested in peace or just dragging things out so it can pursue its ultimate goal?
No, I think Moscow is not at all interested in peace. I think we see all of the conditions that they continually make, trying to manipulate in many ways the American administration, who seems to be more than willing to cave into a certain number of their demands. That's why I think our president here in France has tried at the very least to be very strong and to lead the Europeans into showing that it's not only about what the Russians need, but what Ukraine and what Europe needs is guarantees to security for Ukraine first, and later for Europe more generally, which is the next worry when it comes to Russian influence and Russian aggression.
Elizabeth, thanks for sharing your expertise with us. Elizabeth Sheppard Sellam, thank you.